Welcome to Aarhus University Department of Environmental Science. Aarhus University's campus in Roskilde is proud now to within a few months actually have a second professorship, and we are going to have an inaugural lecture today by Clive Sabel. And Clive has prepared this talk. He's very much looking forward to talk to you. And I think that I will just, without further ado, give the word to Clive.
Thanks, Carsten. That's fantastic. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming here. So first of all, I want to give a few thanks, if you could indulge me. This is perhaps the one day where I'm allowed to set the agenda for the whole talk. And the first thing I'd like to do is thank all new colleagues for being so welcoming to myself and my team when we arrived here. But also to old colleagues all over the world who I've been working with for the last 20 years. And indeed special thanks to one of them, Tessa, who's here today, whom I work with in New Zealand. So thanks, Tessa, for coming. I know you've only come from DTU, but it's nice that we used to work together in New Zealand. And also particular thanks to my PhD supervisors, Professors Tony Gattrell and Robin Flaudier, who unfortunately can't be here today, but I hope you can perhaps look at this lecture later on YouTube. I'd also like to thank my parents, who are here today in the middle of the auditorium. My mum's always asking me what I do, and I think I have singularly failed for about 2 decades to explain this. So maybe after this hour, Mum, you might have a better idea about what I actually do. But more importantly, I would like to thank them because they gave myself and my siblings a real desire to learn and to be inquisitive. And I know we all in the family owe my parents a lot. So this is perhaps another chance for me to say a little thanks to my parents. And then finally, I'd like to, I must thank, indeed, the UK government for providing me with a totally free education. Sadly, this is no longer available, but maybe we shouldn't get too political nowadays. And then before it starts, I want to introduce myself. You know who I am, but I'm a geographer, and I'm really proud to be a geographer. I know we've got a number of geographers in the room. I'm a geographer who tinkers with medical things. I'm also a data scientist. I work with environmental scientists, neurologists, and computer scientists all over the world. My work centres around assessing how people are exposed to environmental pollutants over really long periods of time, perhaps even whole lifetimes. So what I'm going to do for the next, 45 minutes is tell you a story, and I hope you'll come with me on this story. So, why is my work important? Well, I try to solve the etiology, or help solve the etiology of leading causes of mortality and morbidity. The etiology is the study of the causes of diseases. I particularly focus on diseases of long latency, such as some cancers, and then neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and my PhD was on motor neuron disease, and increasingly I'm more and more interested in mental health. And why is it so important now? It's a coming together of theory which has been developed over the last few decades, but much more importantly, we now have the computational power and the jargon you've all heard of, the big data revolution, to enable these things to happen. And I want to illustrate that to you over the next few minutes. So, environmental exposure modelling. I know I'm talking to a lot of people who do this, but I have a particular take on environmental exposure modelling. And it's that traditionally, the approach has been that we assess the risk, or what we might be exposed to, by looking at where we live, and only where we live. However, think about how we move day to day in our lives, and then throughout our lifetimes. And we don't currently estimate exposure by tracking individuals through their daily lives. So perhaps if I can bring this to life by telling a little anecdote. Today, I didn't cycle to work, and that's probably the first time I haven't cycled to work for a long, long time. So I've had a very different exposure today to normal. I sat in the car, and that was a shorter journey. I wasn't exposed to the same pollutants as I normally get as I cycle down the road. And each of us individually has had your own day. You've perhaps had a very normal day, but being in this lecture theatre is unusual for most of us. And let's imagine that this room here has a really bad indoor air pollutant environment. So all of a sudden, at this moment, for an hour, hour and a half, we're all exposed to something different to what we are normally used to. And it's definitely different to how we would normally assess people, which is just asking them or assessing where they live and what's the environment at their home, or potentially at their workplace. But not in this room, that's for sure. For Clive, it's very, very different. You don't come here very often. For Tessa, it's the same, and definitely for my parents. So for each of us, we have different trajectories, and we have different accumulated loads to pollutants. And that is what I'm trying to assess, the day-to-day differences, which can, in the end, over a lifetime, result in how some of us get some diseases and some of us don't, or get other ones. That's it simply. So how do I articulate that? I like to use this diagram a lot. It's one that Anders Sjöström and I developed in the late 90s. Anders is from Sweden, as you can probably guess. And what he did with his PhD, indeed, was look at a typical family of 2 adults and 2 children over a time scale of 24 hours. And just hypothetically looked at the different kind of environmental and indeed mental health impacts that people could be exposed to through a day. And if I illustrate the point that adult 1 goes to a job, got potentially exposed to some environmental pollutants there, went to a meeting, there was a flu virus, somebody in the meeting came with a cold, and the other person in the job got bored at work. The children, one of them was young, one was a bit older. There was some infectious disease, perhaps at the day school, nursery. The other one had an accident on the football ground, and they all came back together at the end of the day and watched TV, even the young one, and got exposed to some stress, a very different kind of stress. And it's this capturing of all of this together across a whole lifetime that really encapsulates my work. So that's it in simple terms. Theoretically, this is the same diagram, of course. What we're doing is imagine that each individual that we're really trying to follow in our work is this red line. And we're trying to understand what are the really important blue columns. Where are the important times and what are the important pollutants, and where do they intersect with how the person moves that we need to study? And a note to the derivation of all this work, Torsten Hagerstrand, who did most of his work in Lund University, just really close to where we are today, developed this. It's the field called time geography, some 50 years ago now. And it's only now, really in the last sort of few years, half a decade or so, that we're actually able to computationally do the work that Torsten developed theoretically. So the kind of questions that we in this department and myself are particularly interested in studying are perhaps to disentangle the role between, is it the environment or is it a genetic predisposition that might cause disease in the future? If we're interested in time, for over what amount of time are we interested in studying? What is the disease latency, i.e. the lag between how people get exposed to something and when the disease arrives or manifests? In terms of location, we might be asking when did the exposure happen, or is it in a number of different places? And Michael Kwan in the States, now at Illinois University, has illustrated this with this diagram. This is a work called the Daily Space-Time Aquarium. And she followed people in Portland, Oregon, as you can see from the slide, and she gave them GPS units. and asked them to just wear them, just carry on normally throughout their days. And she's divided this analysis, and I think this shows the kind of problems that we're trying to solve in our work, between Asian American women in turquoise blue and African American women in purple. And you can see, hopefully, that the two different type ethnicities occupy very, very different space-time trajectories. The African American women who tend to be focused very, very concentrated in this area and much less likely to go out to the suburbs, whereas the Asian American women are much more likely to travel more widely across the city. Now that's really, really interesting if we're interested in how different ethnicities and different groups in societies are exposed to different things, even if they notionally live in the same town. But first of all, I want to rewind to my PhD, because that's where it all started, and you can see how the story is built up from my PhD. So, let's jump to Finland. I did my PhD, or at least the data that I analysed for my PhD was largely from Finland. I studied a very rare disease called motor neuron disease, also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It is a rare disease, but I don't think that matters for the presentation today. I analysed all people who died over a 10-year period from 1985 to 1995, and I tried to look for spatial patterning. Was there somehow a way for me to describe whether there was some spatial clustering of this disease that hitherto nobody had really found any clustering apart from in some very rare occasions during the war and on some rare, for example, the Kia Peninsula in Japan. So this is looking at the whole population, the whole of Finland, and just to see if we could find something. And really the question was, is there a genetic or an environmental clue to the cause of this disease? And what we found, and indeed published towards the end of my PhD, was that indeed this area in the southeast of Finland, in Karelia, had a statistically significant high of the disease that persisted throughout the length of time that I studied. And I'll just point out here on the slide, this is an important point here, that I used the digital buildings register, much like we have in Denmark, to look at where people who died of the disease between 1985 and 1995 lived prior to that, from the date that the register was created in 1965. But we can also look at things through time, and so I developed this animation, and you can see the increment year by year, and you can follow the same sort of patterns here. It's quite interesting. I'll let this flow through a few times. Focus on this area to start with. This is the area where, if you remember, there was this significant high, the area in black, that persists throughout the data set. You know that, of course, in Finland, in the north, there's very few people live there, so there's not much action in terms of the map. So focus our attention mostly down here. But I want to start focusing on this area down here. It starts white, it goes black, it goes through various shades of grey, and then ends in white again. So there is a cluster of less people having the disease in that area, and then more, and then less again. And this the whole point of this animation. It shows how migration and how people move through their lives impacts what might be a static image of how people are exposed to things in geography. So the normal way of looking at things is, where do people die? And that's of course what we tried to look at. So we found significant clusters of where people died, and again they match pretty closely in the southeast area of Finland, as you can see there. But then we thought, well, let's look back to where they were born, and what do we find there? Well, for the sharp-eyed amongst you, you'll notice that the boundary of Finland has changed. That's for reasons of the Second World War, unfortunately. That's an area now that belongs to Russia in this area east of that line there. But if we go back to the 1920s, this is where people were born who subsequently got the disease. And this is really interesting because it shows that either there's something genetically interesting or environmentally interesting about that area or the people who live in that area during a time at which migration was very, very low in Finland. Because of course the problem we've got now is that human mobility is so, as you know, we all move all over the place, don't we? But in Finland about 100 years ago, and it was static for the couple of hundred years before that, that largely represents a very stable population that has something genetically or environmentally about them that can give a clue to this disease. So what I then looked at is how do we unpack this? Can we look at whether the data can show us whether there's an environmental or a genetic cause of the disease? So the first thing I did was just focus on, this is the same map, just focus on those people who were born in that southeast area in Karelia, and then I'll explain why they moved in a minute. So that's in 3D, and that's just in the normal 2 dimensions. What happened was after the war, the Finnish government forcibly repatriated everybody who lived in what is now Russian Karelia into what is now Finland, and settled them in areas of strategic importance for the country, and often for industrial employment. And of course, all those people who ended up getting M&D were all moved, and that's what happened. You can see they all lived. A column is in red is a location, and then a move is in blue, and they all of a sudden at the post-war they all moved, and they moved all over the place. But of course they moved to the major population centres such as Helsinki. And then the interesting question was, what is it about those people and how do they move? So before I move on to the next section, I just want to really talk about those people. There's something about those people that persists in their life from where they were born. They took with them the disease characteristics of the area in which they were born. It might have been their genetics, it might have been environment, it's probably a combination of both. But over a long period of time, at least 60 years, that if you like, imprinted death sentence 60 years later appeared. So, now I want to fast forward. That's about my PhD. I want to fast forward to what I think is fascinating work, which is what I do now, which is to look at things such as big data, social media, and indeed simulation modelling. So the first question I want to ask you is, do you know how much Google knows about you? And in particular, well, it knows a lot about me because I have my phone constantly with me, and it's a Google phone. But the question I just want to explore in these next couple of slides is, how much does it know about your location? So without breaking any type of confidentiality, I'm just showing my data here. Well, it knows where I live, and it knows where I work. It also knows wherever I've been in the last, in fact it shows the last 2 years, and apologies to those of you viewing in New Zealand and Australia, but I was down there as well. And indeed the west coast of the States is not shown. But that's where I've been, okay? Over 2 or 3 years. But what's really interesting if we just focus on one day, and I'll take a day from 8 days ago when I was in the UK. As most of you know, I came back to the UK after Easter, and I drove back here. And I didn't tell Google what I was doing. This is what Google tells me it knows about me. And of course it knows that I drove along a road because I had GPS enabled. Well, that's really, really easy. But what else does it know? Well, it knows that at the time I told Google that I lived in this place called home, which is Taunton. It now knows that I've moved. But so first of all, it knows I moved. That's really, really interesting for them. If they have a whole database about who's moving. The second thing is it knows for some reason that I stopped at IKEA. Well, I did. I had lunch there. I didn't tell it. I didn't tell Google that I was there. But they have an algorithm that recognised I was there. I didn't join their Wi-Fi. I did spend some money, so they could have been tracking my financial records with my credit card. But in fact, I know that they do it just on the length of time that I was there. They know that I refilled the fuel in Tesco's here before getting on the boat, and it knows I was on the boat because of the symbols there. The one thing it got wrong in this whole day was it thought that, you see it says Motorworks there. I didn't mean anything to me. I wondered what it was. It's just a small car repair shop, and I was stuck in a traffic jam for about 30 minutes right outside that shop, and I couldn't understand why I was appearing. And then I looked back and I zoomed in, and so they thought I visited it, but I didn't. I was just outside for a long time. But actually, that's like the best recreation of my day that I could give. It's better than any survey that people could ask me about. It's better than just a normal GPS track that I could give people, and we give people at work here to track how people move. It's really, really good. So Google have this. This is a lovely example of big data, because they could link it with lots of other records, like financial records, to really do some cool things. I think one of the things I want to talk about towards the end of the lecture is the value of big data, not just to be scared of it. So that's what Google knows about me that day. Essentially, this fits in theoretically into this larger area called the quantified self. Essentially, collecting data on yourselves. So I could ask, who of you perhaps have a fitness tracker, maybe a Fitbit or an app on your phone that monitors your physical activity through the day? Anybody? There's a few of you, 3 or 4 of you. Yeah, good. And indeed I do. This is all about this area called me data. We're more and more interested in how we lead our lives, and we're encouraged, of course, to keep fit. Now, does anybody have a Fitbit? Does anybody use Fitbit here? A couple of you, Klaus and Tessa. So do you realise that you are giving Fitbit a huge amount of data for free? Absolutely a huge amount for free, and they're making a lot of money from your data. Do you care? No, and I don't care either, because if we were allowed to access it, it would be a really good research resource. So, let's move on. How do we track ourselves? Well, as I said, a number of us track with these Fitbit bands around our wrists, or more logically, we might have our smartphone in our pockets, which is doing the same kind of thing. But there are a lot of other things that we could do. This is obviously an eye, and it's a little contact lens which has got imprinted on the contact lens a tattoo, a QR code that we can use to understand where people are. The contact lens is see-through as far as the person can see, but we can use it. Or you can see these little tattoos that we can place on people, which is very, very close to this embedding in clothing. So it's not like embedding a smartphone. We're talking about something really, really small, like a fingerprint, a fingernail, that we can get sewn into clothing that helps us track people, and indeed could be an environmental sensor. So the classic one is they're starting to use UV sensors on your shoulders. And you get an alert to say, well, we know you've had the limit for your UV today, you either need to go inside or put some more cream on. But we can do other things too, such as attach microsensors for air pollution, and I'm going to come to that later on in the talk. So I want to bring this all together really with the kind of technologies that I use in my work now, and indeed Lauren and my team use on a daily basis. We use personal sensors, such as the ones we've just seen in the slides. We develop apps ourselves to put on smartphones, and indeed, of course, we have to use the smartphones for GPS and the computation ability to track mobility across time. So we've got sensors on a person. We also use apps, for example, the Moves app, and I'm going to explain how anybody can download the Moves app, Google it later on, and download it if you haven't got it. It's a really neat little free app that tracks where you are, but it also helps you program location. So it can recognise, oh, you're at work, because I know you're at work because you told us, or that's your supermarket that you go to. And we can download that track for each person, and we can learn, oh yeah, that person spends 20 minutes a day shopping, or 2 hours commuting, or 8 hours a day working, for example. And that's really useful. But the power in all this work is joining it all together. So I use simulation modelling, and I've got some slides on that in a minute. We track people, we track them over on smartphones, or we track people as they drive around the city, or indeed cycle. And it's integrating all these things together that's so difficult. So to give you an example, this is just a really, really simple example of one sensor. It's only looking at temperature, but we could look at something more environmentally polluting, like an air pollutant. And the moves app. And we've got one person here for a period of, 12 hours in the waking hours. And you can see really, really clearly how the sensor is very, very susceptible to small changes in temperature, as indeed you can notice the big changes between outdoors, the high temperature, so the outdoors the lower temperatures, and indoors the higher temperatures, whether they're at work or at home, whether indeed you can see walking or going shopping or whatsoever. And the beauty is to use these little sensors, integrating with lots of others, to recreate a person's day. And that's what we're trying to do. One of my past PhD students and myself, Suzanne Steinel, in Edinburgh, did this work where we attached, in this case, PM2.5 sensors to people and asked them to lead their normal lives throughout the day. And we see that, not surprisingly, that there's very low levels of pollution in certain parts of the day, and at other parts of the day, they're really quite high PM2.5 exposures, indeed levels that would exceed the WHO guidelines if they were averaged over the whole 24 hours. And typically these high points tend to be in public transport areas, although in this case this was at the train station, I happen to know. Of course, we have problems when we do this kind of work, and there's a big gap here. Can anybody guess what happened at that point? You won't guess, but they went to the theatre in the cinema that evening, and they had to turn off the sensor because someone complained that it was making slightly too much noise. It wasn't very loud, but it was loud enough that they had to turn it off. Or indeed, you could have the problem in the next slide, little breaks in data collection when the battery was changed or when the battery was running low. These are typical problems. But what I want you to now focus on, this is another person, but also in Edinburgh, over a 24-hour period, is the areas in blue. So the areas of blue are really quite high. The scale has changed, so it's only 15 micrograms per meter cubed, the same pollutant PM2.5, but really high exposures as they go on a bus or walk along a road, as they change from home to work or go home at the end of the day. So this is starting us to help us identify when in a day is most important for us to study when people are exposed to different pollutants. The lovely thing that I'd like to spend a moment or two talking about is this. At the end of the day, at 8 o'clock in the evening, what's happening here? And indeed, at, what's that, is that 6:30, 7 o'clock? There's something also going on there. Can anybody guess, in the home, what that's about? Go on, Gregor, yeah? You have a...
Okay.
They're cooking, yes, they are cooking. And they're cooking to the extent that they're actually not burning anything. This is not, this is just normal cooking. But they were not using an extractor fan, or they didn't open the windows. And you'll see that the point that I want to make from here is that the level remains above the background level, which is down here, for a good, 6-7 hours. And they're breathing that in their house all the time for this length of time. And then they just put another little boost in when they cooked breakfast. And then they went off to work and got, luckily their work was pretty safe. So that's really, really, really interesting. And it's a public health message, what should we say there? Use an extractor fan, open the windows, shut the kitchen door if you have to, and don't let the pollutants go into the rest of the house if you can. But I think it's the temporal scale that's so, so interesting. about that. We know traditionally what people are exposed to averaged over a day, a month, a year, but not over second by second. So before I move on to start to conclude with looking at some more theoretical developments, I want to talk about social media. Because some of you know that I'm really interested in social media and what we can glean from social media that we can't from other data sources. So I've hopefully shown in the last, 20, 25 minutes that we can track people. But what I can't do from all that work is really understand what they're doing without asking them. And indeed, if we do ask people, there's this real problem nowadays with this thing called questionnaire fatigue, as you've all probably experienced yourselves. How many of us have had a phone call? It's increasingly a phone call nowadays. When we're at home, perhaps we're cooking, it's always inconvenient. Hi, have you got 5 minutes? I just want to ask you some questions. And you always say no nowadays. So one way around this, for researchers like myself, is really to pose this question. Can data scientists use social media to help overcome these issues, to find out not only where people are, but what they're thinking and doing at that time? And this is a field called social media data mining, and it's a process of representing, analysing and extracting patterns from social media data. Now, many of us use social media all the time. I try not to, although it's difficult to totally avoid it. But I do use analyse Twitter data quite a lot. And just to give you an idea, I imagine quite a lot of people in the room know of Twitter, and all you do is that you tweet 140 characters, a quick message, you might say, indeed, like this person said, I feel happy. But do you know, as a researcher, that I can get about 40 different variables from that one tweet. I know who you are, I know where you are, if you let me know where you are, I know when you did it, I know where you registered it, I know your gender, I can link it to your past tweets, and so increasingly I can build up a really nice picture of just the individuals who tweet. But I'm not interested in the individuals, because I'm interested in the patterns. And have a look at the patterns in the next slide. So this is in London, and this is not my work. I should acknowledge CASA, that's the Centre for Applied Spatial Analysis at UCL in London. They extracted tweets of people expressing happiness. I feel happy, or the sun's out, I feel great, those kind of positive emotions for London. And they built, this is, as you can hopefully see, a surface of happiness. There are peaks and troughs in the London landscape. These are not hills, real hills, but this is a high, a hill of happiness. And this is a trough or a low of unhappiness. And what the interesting thing to do, of course, is to match that with the real geography. Is this a park? Is this perhaps where people work? Or is this perhaps where people live? And then the next step, of course, is to look at whether this map changes over time. Perhaps this park is a happy place for, let's say, I don't know, children during the day when they're playing there, whereas if, okay, the children wouldn't be tweeting, but if the children were late at night, they would express that they would probably feel scared in that same environment. Likewise, a work environment might, well, let's say in the inner city of London, they might say, okay, I'm at work now, I'm not feeling very happy, but late at night, it might also be the location where people are going out to nightclubs, and they would be feeling happy. So again, we're looking at how things change in time, as well as space, and that's really, really interesting. So the idea of using social media with my work and in my EU project is to largely fill in the gaps to the traditional sources of data collection that we can't otherwise obtain. And then the last way that we use, and indeed this is Lauren Smith's work, Lauren, who many of you know, is to use some form of artificial intelligence, machine learning. I use simulation modelling, a particular form called agent-based modelling in our work. An ABM is difficult to explain, but I'll do my best briefly. So we know that it's quite difficult to obtain data on everybody all around the world all the time. It's just not feasible to do that. But I think we can, and indeed we're proving that we can simulate how people move and behave and interact. And this is what we're trying to do in this computing environment. So if we think about, so the technique is called agent-based modelling. Think of agents as robots. And we just give these robots, and we assign them behaviours and characteristics. We give them a gender, an age, socioeconomic status and ethnicity. And we let them interact, and we give them a certain percentage of them that cycle to work, another certain percentage stay at home, others go shopping, and such like, based on normal census data, so that we get the proportions right. But then the critical thing is they learn from each other and behave in ways that we can't anticipate. Agents start to interact with each other. They interact critically with the environment. They make decisions on their own. They learn from past events, and this could lead to change in their own behaviour and lifestyles. And from that, we can draw conclusions about how societies interact and how exposures differ from different groups in society, in different countries, in different climates, and in different environmental exposures. And we feed that back into our overall model. So that's agent-based modelling, and now I want to show you some work that Lauren's done, and thank you, Lauren, for doing this. This is in Edinburgh. And you can see we've modelled one person here for you, just to illustrate this today. You see the person moving around in yellow here, and their daily life is described in the red line that's moving around the screen there. And imagine this person starts their day here, wait for it to start again, that's where they obviously live, and then they zoom off here to work, and then they come back down here, perhaps they go shopping at the end of the day down here, they go back to home here, and at the end of the day they go socialising in the Royal Mile near the castle in Edinburgh, and come back to sleep in their home there. So that's what we do with agent-based modelling. We artificially model how people live their lives based on rules, sensible rules. And that's all very well. But what happens if we then superimpose an air pollution surface on that person? So we know that this is where they started their day, and they led quite a bit of their day in a high pollutant area. This is, I should say, NO2, again for Edinburgh. But they work over here in a pretty low pollution area. And what we end up doing is we accumulate over the whole day, we add up their accumulated exposure to give them a daily dose, if you like. And we can do that for hundreds of thousands, millions of people inside the ABM. It happens really, really fast, just like that. And from that, we can build up how different groups in society are differentially exposed to air pollutants. So what I've done in the last half an hour now, or 35 minutes, is illustrate a number of ways that I'm working with the latest kind of technology and data to assemble different kinds of sensors, like fixed sensors or mobile sensors, or smartphones with apps, or indeed activity sensors like the Fitbit, together inside a technology that I haven't even mentioned so far, GIS, which is my background, to produce something which is absolutely, hopefully, fantastic. The idea is to really get a grasp on how people move and what that means for their environmental exposures. So that's what I do, and that's what I try to do. And this all comes together really nicely with how I'm going to finish the talk by talking about a concept called the exposome that I'm heavily involved with in a couple of my EU projects at the moment. This is a new theoretical development that somebody called Chris Wilde in the US really created about 10 years ago. It's new. And he did it because he was pretty fed up with the amount of attention and research funding that the genetic biologists were getting for their work in understanding the human genome. And he was saying, well, all this work in the environmental exposure area is being largely forgotten. And what is this exposome that Chris is really talking about? Well, he defines it quite simply. It's the totality of exposure from physical and social environments, lifestyle, behaviour, during all stages of life. Indeed, from conception through to death. And this is not a new idea. Indeed, some 200 years ago, people were drawing diagrams like this, starting with where people were born, as they went through adolescence and middle age to old age and death. But now we're able to bring this all together in a conceptual way and apply for funding, and this is what we're doing. to the exposed zone. It consists of 3 or 4 different areas. This circle here is where I work, the general external environment. I'm really interested in how people are exposed to, for example, their urban environment, traffic, indeed their social capital, what they get from talking and interacting with neighbours and colleagues at work, what their exposure in green space and blue space is like. There are other people who are very interested in the whole behavioural area, what diet people have, whether they smoke, what consumer products, cleaning products they use in their home, their diet, whether they have a lot of physical activity or not. There are others that are interested in the impacts on the internals of the body environment, so the inputs from the behaviour and the external environment goes to the internals of the body, and it all comes together with an impact assessment across society for large populations, and I'll note this arrow along the bottom, across the whole life period for lots and lots of people, for millions of people. And if we do that, we do this rigorously, using the kind of techniques that I spent the last 40 minutes talking about, we hope to provide... That's fine. We hope to provide causes to some of the intractable diseases that we really can't solve at the moment. What we want to really suggest, however, is that there are some, if you noted the point, there are some critical points in people's lives that we really need to focus on. We could look across the whole lifetime from birth to death, but in the times when there's the most genetic change in the human being, sorry, cell division rather than genetic change, is in the first 2 years of life and during adolescence. And we think it's during those times that we need to focus our attention. It's hard to look at everything, and so in our EU project we're focusing down this end of the scale. So my last slide, I want to try and bring this all home to say, what would I like you just to remember from today? What's hopefully important? Well, first of all, about me. Hopefully you'll see that I'm a combination of a geographer, a data scientist, an exposure assessment scientist, and indeed someone who does something called geocomputation. I work hard to try and solve some of the really difficult medical challenges that we have in society today by tracking people through their lives. And I can't do that on my own. I work with qualified medics, often neurologists. And then the last point I really want to mention is the big data paradox. There's a lot of negative energy out there in the world about the role of Big Brother and the people such as Google and Apple and the other big 7 technology companies, how they track us and how they make money from collecting data about us. But also I want to say from a researcher perspective that this data is an invaluable tool, and I really enjoy working with this data. And so it's part of our role to actually say we should have access to this data, given suitable safeguards, and we can do really good things for society with this data, such as solving diseases that we don't know what causes them at the moment. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for a really interesting talk and presentation. It was fascinating just to sort of see how it's all kind of come together, really, from your PhD as well. And I guess I sit here quite obviously as not being Danish, but working here for sort of 4.5 years. But my question really is, you've talked a lot, I mean, obviously your research is highly international and you've worked all over the world. But really, sort of, how do you sort of see your research fitting into more of a kind of Danish research agenda, I suppose? I mean, probably majority here are Danes, so I'm kind of maybe asking a question on their behalf as well. But how do you sort of see, the importance of the kind of Danish, society and research agenda? So that's my question.
Okay. Thank you, Tessa. I've been reminded that I should repeat the questions, but I think everybody did hear it, and it's nice and clear. It's how does my research, how could my research in the future work in the Danish environment, in the Danish research environment. And there are two or three ways I think that's nice and easily done. The first thing I want to do is to really use the fantastic Danish registers, those are the registry data. So not only the health registers, but the building registers, the personal register, the CPR register. So as people move from house to house to house, it's all tracked. And that's the building blocks for all my work. So that's the first thing. Thinking through, I mean, the obvious thing is actually to start to really enjoy working with colleagues in the room who work on air pollution and use sensors. And I think the thing that I'm offering, that I'm bringing here to Aarhus is the personalised, the temporal scale, looking at a finer resolution in both of those, instead of assuming that people's air pollution is simply estimated from a fixed roadside monitor. It's not the road that's concerned about the air pollution, but the people that walk along the road who might be walking on that road for 2 minutes. So it's the personal approach. So I think that there are two ways of answering that question: using the fantastic resources in Denmark for the registry data, but also to really enjoy working with new colleagues here. Okay, thanks. Any other questions? I dared my mum to ask a question, but she might dare to ask one. A couple of questions, one at the back and a couple down here.
Thank you, Clive, for a very interesting talk. And you're obviously very good in tracking people in spaces. And as you have realized, in our department, or our section, we are concerned about spatial and temporal changes in air pollution. How you would deal with both a lot of changes both in time and space. It appears to me that your air pollution maps, they were like more static and not as changing as in the real life. But if both is changing a lot, both there's buses passing by and there might be very short time changes in air pollution maps and also location. If you put it all together, will it be only noise, or will it be able to resolve both changes in time and space?
Thanks, good question. And then just to summarise my understanding of the question is, I've spent a lot of the last 40 minutes talking about how people move, yeah. But of course pollutants move as well. Yeah. And that's really about what the question is there. And I was aware as I was building up the presentation over the last couple of weeks that I didn't focus on the changing pollutant environment. Of course I'm aware of that, and I've simplified it massively just for today's presentation. But of course we do often get hourly, at least in Edinburgh, updates on any air pollutant surface that we're modelling. It's something that we do feed into our agent-based modelling, but it depends how we do it. If we're doing it with a person, attached to a lapel, perhaps with a small microsensor, then we're getting probably very raw estimates from a not very accurate sensor, but you would see variation over time, minute by minute. If we wanted to get a really accurate air pollutant surface, we would use the fixed sense monitoring sites that you're well aware of, and in models, perhaps hourly, which is pretty good, and we do that. But I think that's the beauty of why hopefully I've been appointed and why you're here, so we can work together, and that's the beauty of that, and that's really what we do. Yeah. Okay, and there were two questions at the front. I know Clive had a question, and there's another question down here. We've got time, so let's get everybody's thoughts. Hello. Yeah.
Thanks for a very nice presentation. Some people, when they can eat as lot as they want and they don't gain weight. Others, they look at a cake and then they explode. How do you see genetics coming into this work? Are you already doing that in collaboration with others, or is that something that will come down the road and being put into the models?
Okay, the question is about how I integrate genetics into the field that I'm working in. I think well, although I've mentioned genetics a number of times in my talk, I should recognise that I'm not a biologist. I dabble in these things, but I'm not the expert. So, of course, what we do in the big projects that we work in Europe is with specialists and geneticists who are contributing their own perspectives to, for example, the exposome. But I'm slightly cautious about answering the question. I know the boundaries to what I know, and I know that I don't know very much about genetics. I know a little bit more about my PhD subjects, so in the motor neuron disease work in Finland, and I've read a lot and worked with a lot of neurologists there about the genetic predisposition of people to get a motor neuron disease in later life. So I can perhaps talk a little bit more about that case and use that to illustrate how we could use it in other places. So in Finland, about 100 years ago, there was a particular subset of the population that had a very rare set of genetic genes and a very high percentage of the population there had it, well, a relatively high percentage. And these people, it turned out, in later life, were more likely to get motor neuron disease. So there's a lot of suggestion that, and this whole area of the gene-environment interaction is really popular in the popular press, but also in the research environments at the moment. Is to what extent is this interaction? It's not a simple case as, oh, you've got a genetic predisposition to getting, say, cancer, therefore you will get it. But it's rather that, yes, you might have a slightly raised elevation when you were born to get it, but it has to be triggered by something. And often that trigger is an environmental trigger. It might be an environmental stress, so it might be literally something like a bone fracture or a car accident, or it might be an emotional stress, a divorce or something. But these things all accumulate in your lives, and it does end up with a raised incidence at a population level. So the story is very, very complicated. It does depend from disease to disease, but it is incorporated in the exposome model quite well. But it's not the area that I personally contribute, but I do work with other people who know more about it. That's probably like the limit of where I would go. I don't want to claim beyond what I know. I hope that helps a little bit. I think Clive had a question. Is there still a question? No? Anybody else? Jana? Okay.
You mentioned your interest in the exposures, but what about the behavioral response to this exposure? A little bit following that previous question about this variation of the air pollution. So do you have chances of identifying if people have this pollution data, can you then track how they change their behavior?
Okay, a very interesting question about looking at how do people respond to being aware of different, let's call it air pollutants, but pollutants, and then change their behaviour. For example, they might change their mode of transport to work, or they might go a quieter way, or they might go at a different time. Trying to think that there is work out there, but that's not work that I'm closely involved with. If I go back a slide or two, you remember that this is my area of work, and you're talking about this area up here. That's an area I know of, but I don't work in it myself. And and there are some really nice pieces of work. There's a really good piece of work in London, for example, where you can route from A to B, the shortest path or the quickest path. There is now an option in one or two algorithms to say the least pollutant path. So you can go from A to B, take via C that might take slightly longer, but you'll inhale less. For example, air pollution. I think that's the next stage. Actually, it's looking at the horizon about what's coming. Is to say, how can we look at, and we can do this with ABM as well. Actually, so I can use the computer models to actually assess how people might change their behaviour in the future and what impact that will have on them. I'm just trying to think through in real time what the implications of the question are. It's not a simple question. I think it's perhaps one of the next research projects that we could bid for. I think that would be looking at that. It's a really interesting idea, actually. Can you remind me? We'll talk about it next week. Yeah, really good. Yeah. There's a question at the back. Thanks.
Yes, of course, it would be very, very nice to be able to have personal exposure for a lot of people, as you point out. So far, we have mainly based exposure assessment and linked to health from a location-based approach, you can say, mainly where you live, or in some cases where you work. Have you been involved in studies, where you actually have compared these two approaches, to really show, what is the add-on for going into personal exposure, and then also linking it to the health? Does it actually matter?
Yeah. Very, very good question, and I could let my postdoc Lauren answer that one. Lauren? That's really unfair. So the question was a really good question. Have we done a study which compares the two approaches, the traditional approach of looking at the environmental exposure based on perhaps where you live or work, compared to the approach that I spent the last hour talking about? And why I've teased Lauren about that is because that's the paper she's meant to be writing right now, and she's coming to the writing week next week to finish it. So wait a week and we'll tell you. Then do we go as far as to look at the health impact? Not in that paper, but that will be the next paper. Because that's really a really important thing. Yes, we could look at a different environmental exposure, but does it make a difference is your question, and we need to know that question. And I know, of course, perhaps you were leading me towards let's do that work together, because your approach and my approach with suitable Danish exposures and health impacts would be fantastic. Very good. Is there time for one more, Carsten? I think we're overrunning the time really, but any one more, or shall we? I'm kind of waiting for a drink at the back there. There's some nice wine at the back. Yeah. I don't see an urgent question, so yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Clive. So we would meet outside for a drink and some toasts. Okay.